Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture covers the human appendicular skeleton. In a previous lecture, we learned that the appendicular skeleton includes the girdles and the limbs. Today, we're going to learn a lot more about which bones make up the girdles and the limbs, respectively. And then finally, we're going to conclude by looking at the muscle attachment points and their significance to generating specific motion. Helping us out today, we have our friend from the anatomy lab, a skeletal model. It's actually a male skeletal model. We'll be using some pictures, and then we'll actually be referring to parts on your own body that you can actually feel to learn about the appendicular skeleton. For a quick review, recall that the skeletal system is actually broken up into two major divisions. We have the axial skeleton, which if you take a good look at this picture, we see that the axial skeleton is actually all in green. And then we have the appendicular skeleton, which is shown in yellow. The appendicular skeleton, which we're covering today, itself is broken up into several divisions. We have our limbs, including our upper limbs, otherwise known as the arms and hands, and the lower limbs, legs and feet, and then the limbs are supported by girdles. We have a pectoral girdle and a pelvic girdle. When we start our tour, we're actually going to start a little bit lower with the pelvic girdle, working our way down into the lower limb, and then we'll move up to the pectoral girdle, work our way through the upper limb, and then finally we'll take a look at those attachment points for muscles. So let's go ahead and get started. On this picture here, you can see that the pelvic girdle consists of one hip bone, but adults actually have two, one for each side. So together they make up the pelvic girdle, so there's two hip bones. Let's actually turn to the model and see if we can find those same hip bones. So if we take a look at this model here, and you go down to the pelvis area, you'll notice that we have one hip bone in an adult. In a juvenile, there's actually a couple hip bones that have not yet fused together, but in an adult, it's one fused hip bone. If I turn the model to the side, you can see the hip bone actually comes around and to the back a little bit. Now, many people know where their pelvis is, and so if we take a look at the model here, we can actually find the pelvis, which includes the pelvic girdle, both hip bones. You can see there's one for each side, plus part of the vertebral column on the back. Now remember, the vertebral column itself is actually part of the axial skeleton, not the appendicular skeleton. But right here we have the sacral region, and then down here we have our tailbone. So that circular ring actually makes up the pelvic girdle. From here, let's move to the lower limb. The lower limb consists of multiple bones, so you might want to get out a piece of paper and actually write these names down. We have the femur, the tibia, the fibula, the patella, and finally we have a series of bones that make up the foot. So what we're going to do is we're going to work our way from the pelvic girdle down all the way to the foot and take a look at which bones are which. We'll go ahead and start with the long bones of the legs. The long bones of the leg that make up the entire length of the leg are going to be the femur, the tibia, and the fibula. So let's actually turn back to our skeletal model and take a look at those. So right here, coming off the pelvic girdle, you might see there's a nice little notch in there for another bone to fit. And you can see that this circular area right here, spherical area of the femur, fits perfectly in there. And that actually makes up your hip joint and allows you to rotate your leg at the hip area. So the femur is going to be the only bone right here. It's a nice big long bone that actually makes up the upper part of your leg. So you would think your femur would be right around here in your own body. So right here is going to be where your femur is. It's a little difficult to actually feel the femur because it's covered by muscle. But let's actually move to the lower leg and we'll be able to feel some of those bones. When we get down to the lower leg, you'll notice that the lower leg right here is actually two long bones. A really big one called the tibia, which is right here, and then the fibula, which is on the side. A lot of students actually get those mixed up, so there's a cute way to remember which one is which. If you've ever heard or told of little white lie, then you might know that a lie means fib. And so we say we have our little white fibula down over here because it's the little one. And the tibia is the really big one. And then, of course, we have our patella, which is going to be an extra bone that helps stabilize the joint at the knee. And the patella is also known as the kneecap. So let's see if we can actually find some of these bones on ourselves. If you take a look at your leg and you run your finger down the very front of your shin, that bone that you feel right there, that shin bone, that's actually the tibia. You can feel it right there on the very front. If you move to the side and you actually run your finger down to the very ankle, there's an ankle bone right there. That bone is actually the fibula, which is part of the fibula there. And then, of course, most people have felt their kneecap before. It's kind of a circular bone. It's not quite circular, but almost, right here on the front. And as you flex your knee, you'll actually feel the edges of that patella. So from there, let's go ahead and move to the bones of the foot. When we actually look at the foot bone, which we'll do here in a moment, you'll realize that the bones of the feet, there's a lot more of them than there are in the leg. And so rather than learn each bone individually, at this level, it's a little easier to just break it up into groups. And so those groups are called the tarsals, the metatarsals, and the phalanges, respectively. So now let's actually go down to the model, and we'll see if we can identify those bones on this guy here. So what we have, when we take a look at the foot, if you get a nice close-up there, you might see that we actually have a bunch of bones that kind of look a little squat, almost cuboidal, like cubes here, that are found very near where you would expect your ankle to be found. And collectively, those set of bones are known as the tarsals. Then we have a set of longer bones that extend, and you'll see 5 of them that we assume are eventually going to become our toes, our 5 toes. And those 5 long bones that come off are going to be the metatarsals. And finally, you have a set of smaller bones up here that represent what you know as your toes, and those are going to be your phalanges. So again, tarsals, metatarsals down here, and then finally we have the phalanges that make up the area you know of as your toes. So with that, let's actually turn our attention to the upper area of the appendicular skeleton. Okay, so if we take a look at this model here, what we're really looking for is going to be how does this limb connect to the axial skeleton, which in this case would be the rib cage or the thoracic cage. And we might notice some extra bones here that seem to maybe be attachment points. There's actually 2 that make up the pectoral girdle. They are the S-shaped clavicle, which I'm running my finger along right here, the S-shaped clavicle. And then along the back side, we actually have another bone that represents part of it, and it is the scapula. Now, you actually can find both of these bones on your body. If you turn and actually run your finger along your collarbone is your clavicle, and then the bone that you know of as your shoulder blade is going to be your scapula. Now, what's really interesting about this, although it's not necessarily obvious on this model here, is that the scapula, which is the larger of the 2 bones here on the back, is not directly fused to any part of this thoracic cage. Rather, the scapula is allowed to float and move back and forth along that rib cage, and that is part of what allows us to have so much movement in our shoulder joint. So by not attaching it, but allowing it to float, we can have quite a lot of movement in our shoulder joint. And so it's one of the reasons why the shoulder joint has the widest range of motion of any joint in our body. In fact, the only attachment point is up here in the collarbone, right there, or the clavicle. Okay, so now that we've taken a look at the clavicle and the scapula as being part of the pectoral girdle, let's take a look at the upper limb. Just like with the lower limb, the upper limb consists of multiple bones, so you might want to write these down. The upper limb is going to include the humerus, the radius, the ulna, and finally the set of bones that make up the hand. So now let's turn back to our model and see if we can take a look at these bones. All right, so first here, coming out of the scapula, you'll see the bone that makes up the upper region of your arm right here. And you'll notice that this bone kind of looks very similar to the femur. It's kind of a similar look, but this one is called the humerus. And once again, we kind of see a rounded surface here that plugs into a little notch in there for attachment to the shoulder joint. And then as we come down, we get the elbow joint, this being the elbow joint, and we actually get two bones down here, the radius and the ulna. Now, when you first look at these, sometimes it's a little difficult to distinguish between the radius and the ulna. So let's spend a little bit more time looking at these bones and seeing if we can figure out what each bone does. All right, I'm actually going to turn you to the back side of this arm first. And when we do that, what we notice is that we have an elbow point there. Each person should go ahead and confirm they have an elbow right here. What you are feeling is part of the ulna. So that's going to be the ulna that actually articulates or forms that elbow joint with the humerus. And so if you follow the ulna down, and I've got my fingers that are coming down here to the very base of the near the wrist, you'll notice that the ulna actually seems to decrease in size quite a bit. But over here we have the radius, and the radius is much larger. But if you follow the radius up, you'll notice that when we start, the radius is smaller. So they kind of change out a little bit as we move down the length of the forearm. There's kind of a cute way to remember which one each bone does. If you go down here to the hand, you'll notice that the radius plays the major role in articulating with the hands or the bones of the hand to form the wrist. And so we say the bones of the hand radiate out from the radius, and that's how you can remember that. And then when we go up here to the ulna with the elbow, if you've ever hit your elbow on a hard edge, it really hurts. And so you go, well, is for ulna. So that's what you're hitting, is your ulna. All right, and finally, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the bones of the hand. The bones of the hand are very similar to the bones of the feet, where you have a whole lot of bones in here and kind of the same arrangement. So the bones of the hand are actually going to be the carpals, the metacarpals, and the phalanges respectively. So what we want to do is we want to come back to this model here, see if we can actually see some of these. We have another set of bones that is right at the base of the wrist area here that seem to be very similar to the foot bones, where they are kind of cube-shaped and a little squat. And those are going to be the carpals. And then out of that, we have a set of long bones that comes out, and those are going to be the metacarpals. So the metacarpals are going to be the first set of long bones that come from the carpals. And then finally, we have the set of bones that make up the fingers, and those are the phalanges. So if you actually take a look at your hand, you would expect to find the carpals right around here, the metacarpals right around here, still in the base of the hand, and then the phalanges are going to be the fingers, so that area right there. Key way to remember carpals from tarsals. A lot of people know of carpal tunnel syndrome, which is in the wrist area. Carpal tunnel syndrome makes its appearance right there, right by those carpals. All right, so finally what we're going to do is we're going to turn him around and take a good look at some attachment points. All right. As kind of an emphasis on how attachment points matter in generating muscle motion, what we're going to do is we're going to look at two muscles that participate in what is known as the rotator cuff, a set of muscles that helps actually stabilize that shoulder and generate motion. The two that we're going to look at both attach on the back side of the humerus here, and then as well also with the scapula. One attaches at the lower end, goes here to the bottom of the scapula. The other attaches at the upper end here and goes to the top of the scapula. Even though they both look like they attach at the same spot, when you draw a string or a line from one to the other and you rotate it, you'll notice that it actually creates this motion, a medial rotation. So from here to here creates a medial rotation, but from the top all the way underneath to the top of the scapula creates this motion here, which is also known as abduction. Again, two areas that seem almost identical, but because they have slightly different locations on the same bone, they generate two different motions. Medial rotation would be the lower one, the upper one, abduction, like so. And that concludes our tour of the appendicular skeleton. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.